The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. There's an old saying that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Well, I'm not sure what a politician by any other name would smell like, but in today's program, we're going to look at the names we use in politics today. Labels like liberal and conservative. We may just find there's not as much difference as you think.
Our program, as usual, will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an in-depth analysis of the entire subject by our panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report by any other name following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty, because we agree with Thomas Jefferson, that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
I often think it's comical, ta-la-la, ta-la-la, how nature always does contrive, ta-la-la-la, that every boy and every gal that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative.
Is it that simple?
Well, it might have been in Victorian times, but I don't think it's so simple today. The labels today don't mean what they did then, first of all. And second of all, probably even in those times, it probably wasn't that simple. But the labels today certainly don't mean what they did in Gilbert and Sullivan's time.
Most people are born with no particular ideology. I think they get cultural values in a broad sense from their grandparents, their parents, their neighborhood. But I think ideology is something you get later, and it's more political. It's less cultural. So that if you say, are you really a conservative, it'd be interesting to know what people mean by that.
In 19th century Britain, what liberal meant was really a free trade person. That was one of the prime aspects of being a liberal, is it meant a free trade person. It meant increased political participation of the ordinary person. It meant economic liberty, economic liberalism, as opposed to the conservatives of the conservativism of the aristocratic classes.
In the marketplace of public opinion, there are two polar opposites. There are economic conservatives and economic liberals. And you can, by asking the right questions regarding our national economy and the world economy, separate people along a continuum from a conservative economic view of our country and the world to a liberal economic view of our country and the world. And one definition of the word conservative liberal has to do with the economic orientation a person takes. The second way you have to look at it is in terms of their social orientation. Today, you have to take liberal conservative and put it along a social dimension of social liberal conservatism, and not just on civil rights, but on a whole shopping list of rights issues in the social area. And you can, again, by asking the right set of questions, distribute people between two polar extremes on liberal conservative social issues. Virtually everyone can place themselves along a political continuum that ranges from politically conservative to politically liberal. Today, about 55% of the American public place themselves on the conservative side of the continuum. About 40% place themselves on the liberal side of the continuum. And then if you ask them to define that, they can go ahead and usually will define it in terms of that type of conservative or liberal definition which is most meaningful to them. Those who focus on economics will describe their conservatism or liberalism in terms of economic necessities or economic issues or points of view. Those who focus on social issues will do that for social issues and the environment or whatever.
The interesting thing about the political game is that the name of the game is define or be defined. It's not to kill or be killed. It's define or be defined. It's exactly the equivalent of killing or being killed. So if you can foist a label onto your opponents that is in some way derogatory or has negative imagery, that's very much to your advantage.
And what I've had to do is to define not just my position, but to define his, and I hope I've done it fairly. I have defined the issues, and I am not going to let Governor Dukakis go through this election without explaining some of these very liberal positions. He's the one that
For
said,
candidate Bush in 1988, defining his opponent as a liberal was a successful attack. Why?
primary votes.
This is a country which will not elect a liberal to the presidency until the next major economic collapse.
And one of the interesting phenomena that we have in the political parties is the strength of the Republican parties in the presidency and the strength of the Democratic Party in the Congress. And one hypothesis about why that might be is that when people go to elect a congressman, they want somebody who's good at bringing home the bacon. But when they think a little bit more broadly about the whole issue, they think, gee, that's they're really kind of uncomfortable about the idea of everybody out there scrambling. And so maybe you select a president that you think will put some kind of lid on that whole process.
Another way to separate the political players is to put them on a line according to how much they support government intervention in people's lives, regardless of the kind of intervention involved.
I think you'd have, at those polls, you'd have a very mixed bag. You'd have interventionists who would include both conservatives and liberals for certain kinds of issues. You'd have non-interventionists who would include both conservatives and liberals for other kinds of issues and events.
Well, I think part of where conservatism, ran into some trouble was that we developed a theory of being anti-government. Well, in fact, that's nonsense. Conservatives are for very strong government. We loved Schwarzkopf winning in the Persian Gulf. That's strong government. We'd like a drug-free America. That would be strong government. We'd like every child to be able to read and write. That would be a very strong, effective education system. We might argue with the liberals about how to get to that. We might argue for a much more parental choice model of education. We might argue that you need much more repression in terms of what you do with criminals. But we, in fact, want, in many ways, the government to work. And I think it's important for us to understand that interventionism could be good or bad depending on what you think you're going to accomplish and what your goals are.
One tends to find what we describe as liberals, what we, in modern American parlance, describe as liberals, tend to be more interventionist in the economic sphere and not so much interventionist in social and moral matters. And it's kind of a mixed bag on foreign policy, you must say. Foreign policy is complicated because they'd intervene for some people and not for others, and it's much harder to have a clear theory about that, I think. Conservatives, on the other hand, would tend to be less interventionist in economics, more interventionist in social and moral matters, and again, a mixed bag with foreign policies.
Liberal or conservative, consistent interventionists are authoritarian. The word libertarian is used today for non-interventionists.
You think of the world as interventionist versus non-interventionist. Certainly libertarians would describe them, people who describe themselves as libertarians would be people who would be non-interventionist in economics, in social and moral issues, and in foreign policy. Those are self-described libertarians.
Liberal, conservative, libertarian. No one knows for sure why different people see things so differently. But whether we're born that way or learn it, whether we cling to our ideology or abandon all principles at the drop of a hat, our basic political views and those of our leaders make real differences in the way we live. For better or worse.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
We got the Constitution, we got the Bill of Rights. I mean, that's where the country's structured. And
each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching are the unrehearsed reactions of people in St. Louis, Missouri, to the probe report by any other name.
Maintained, and I guess that's where we have to watch, where sometimes the federal doesn't do too much or it shouldn't be doing things that the state should be doing. And as said, that, you know, we don't always need the government to tell us, you know, when to tie our shoes or below our nose.
Some people are ashamed to say I'm a conservative because it's got a bad connotation to it.
When you say liberal, I think, ooh, there could be a wild idea there or something that's kind of way out.
Now, someone tells you a certain politician is a moderate. What does that mean?
Talks out both sides of his mouth, just like he was saying. He'll tell you whatever you want to hear.
I said he's a mugwump. He's got his mug on one side and his wump on the other.
The liberal would be against, and the conservative would be, no, I'm sorry, I haven't switched. The liberal would be, yeah. The liberal would be against, and the conservative, to a certain extent, I guess they would be for.
The first big mistake is just to say you're a politician.
Okay, the liberal would be against, and the conservative.
No, you did it again. Our politics is foolish.
And when you're talking politicians, you can put any kind of label you want on them. They're all liars. They got one job. They got one job. 4 years from now, I got to get reelected. I'm going to tell you exactly what you want to hear.
The conservative people is more for big business. They forget the other half that live in the United States. And this is what I think conservatism. It's only for a few things, just to help a few people.
Where the conservative wants to conserve, the liberal is more free spending, so to speak.
The word libertarian, it reminds me of give me liberty, give me death, way back in the beginning of our country.
I don't really understand the libertarian thing all that great, but I do stand for the government keeping out of our lives as much as possible.
As far as home life is concerned, I don't think government should play any role as far as getting into people's personal lives.
When it comes to your life and mine and theirs, they shouldn't be involved other than education. And they've let the ball drop on that.
The government never admits they're wrong, even when there's proof positive.
And they don't have to. Just like the IRS and them.
Well, the government is other people. They should have to. They should have to.
They're not accountable to anyone.
I consider the presidential election a lot more important than just to go and pick one because he's liberal and one because he's conservative. I want to know what those issues are. Why do you consider him a liberal? And he's a conservative. Why do you consider him? What are his issues? What are the things that he's for?
We select the lesser of the two evils.
That's right.
That's right.
I don't think I've ever heard such a mix of cynicism and confusion all in one place. Let's see if our panel of experts can straighten this out. John Fund is an editorial page writer for the Wall Street Journal, and Ed Hudgens is director of the Center for International Growth at the Heritage Foundation. And our host and permanent panelist is chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, I was struck by Newt Gingrich's comment in the probe report that conservatives were now for big government. Did I hear him right?
I think you did. I think that should disturb a lot of people. I guess it's not a total surprise for me to hear that, but I think a lot of people in this country who still call themselves conservatives would be surprised to hear this. I think that many people in the country who want to be conservatives would like to see less government. I'm under the belief that the majority of the people who voted for Ronald Reagan voted less government, do away with the liberal big spenders.
Well, conservatives voted for George Bush, and as Ed Hudgens has pointed out, Bush is responsible for a 20% increase in domestic spending in 1991. Is that conservative?
And he was after he was after Dukakis for being the liberal. What would have happened if we would have had a liberal in?
Yeah. In one sense, we're going back to the older definitions. Conservative 100 years ago had a bad connotation. It was someone who wanted to manage the economy, usually for special interest groups. Okay. And it seems that, in a sense, with the Bush administration, we're getting back to just that. In other words, they want to tinker a little bit. They want good government. They don't want less government, right? They want maybe some special subsidies for businesses, maybe a little bit of trade protectionism here and there to help things along. They only differ in the kind of
spending they want.
It's just who is the one who benefits, and that seems to be the issue.
Okay, but do you think it's safe to make a general statement that conservatives probably are generally more for free enterprise than the liberal?
Free enterprise for big business, not necessarily.
You wouldn't even concede that they're very good, well, free enterprise, does that mean special privileges for big business?
Tariff barriers, both conservatives
and that's
and liberals
not free
support.
enterprise, though, is it?
Exactly.
So you don't even give the conservatives any credit at all for being for free enterprise, and yet a lot of people are voting conservative because they think they're voting for free enterprise.
I think at the grassroots that's true. That's what they think that they are voting for. But their leaders, I think, are the ones who have gone back on the meaning of the philosophy.
Well,
and that's
Newt Gingrich on the preliminary program, was pretty blunt. Some are a little bit more conspiratorial in what they do. They say the things they want to hear. But I think he was very blunt. He says we're for big government in certain areas.
I mean, in one sense, there is a strategic reason why you might want to play down a label at a given point in time. Okay, to say, for example, well, I don't know if this is liberal or conservative, but what do you think about this idea? For example, giving parents more choice about where they send their children and where they spend their money. Is that liberal or conservative? The best example is in Peru, where Hernando de Soto, a free marketeer, uses all the revolutionary rhetoric. He talks about how we have a ruling elite in our country and they're repressing the people, and we want rights for the people. We want every person to have the right to own land. We want every person to have the right to trade freely without going through government, elite marketing boards and so on. He's using all of the sort of liberal leftist rhetoric to promote free market economics, which is what happened 200 years ago.
Conservatives have some skepticism about some spending, but when it comes to the Pentagon or to the police and the war on drugs, for example, all of this skepticism seems to go out the door.
So they're even big spenders. So you elect a so-called conservative president like Bush or Reagan, they still spend a lot of money.
I'm proud of our troops, but the Pentagon bureaucrats, they're the post office with guns.
Yeah.
They're just as inefficient as any other government agency, and they need to be watched.
Well, can we give the liberals any more credit? Are liberals good civil libertarians? Are they good in defending civil liberties, personal liberties?
Look at our nation's universities. You see increasing curbs on free speech.
By liberals?
By liberals. Free speech is fine unless it offends certain protected groups. Free speech is fine unless it violates certain political taboos. They want to literally expel students from college for simply exercising their freedom.
So if somebody's for less government and they want to vote conservatives for economic freedom, you're saying they might not get it. If you're a liberal and you want less government on our personal lives and protect civil liberties, and you vote for a liberal, you might not get protection of civil liberties.
Either.
So that person that is for definitely less government may end up a little bit frustrated.
I think voters recognize this. Look, the world is not two-dimensional. Neither is politics. Voters increasingly are frustrated that they only have two choices. Many of them simply say that they would rather have none of the above, given what's offered to them, because right now no party represents the philosophy of our founding fathers, which was that we should be a nation of individual self-governors.
So what would they be categorized? If you wanted to give them a label, you say self-governing, does that mean conservative, liberal, or libertarian, or what would you call the founders?
I don't think they would use a label, but I think that they would reject overbearing government in all areas of life.
Yeah. Remember, there was a fundamental premise I think our founders came from in the constitutional sense. They assumed that individuals had the right, the freedom to do as they wanted as long as they didn't initiate force against others, that is, harm others, and that a constitution sets out specific limited powers for the government to help protect rights. Okay? So the citizen doesn't have to justify why he should do something. The government has to justify why they have to do something. That was the original
So the
intent.
Constitution then was there to restrict government power rather than telling people what to do or what the government was going to do for the people.
Precisely. That's why you need a Constitution, to give very special limits on government, and the system has been reversed.
And both conservatives and liberals have more or less endorsed the Supreme Court decisions of the last 40 or 50 years, which basically say Congress can pass any law that it wants with regard to the economy and vast areas of private life. Both liberals and conservatives don't want to return to a pre-New Deal civil court.
Now, if you look at it in a completely negative manner, you say, well, it can't be all that bad because we keep electing people who are pushing big government, conservative or the liberal style. But the other point I think you were making is that there's a large number of people who are sort of dropping out, the people who would vote for none of the above. What percent of the people were required to elect the president last time?
Only about 50% of eligible adults voted for president. If you go down to Congress, it's 38 or 39%. You know, one out
So
of
there's
four,
only half of that elects the individual.
And it's even worse than that. You know, 1 out of 4 congressmen last time ran unopposed. We don't even give them 2 choices.
So the frustration level must go up for those people who would like to have constitutional government. And how valuable do you think it is talking about labels? Do you think that this is more confusion and it's helpful, or do you think people ought to try to understand what liberal means and what conservative means, or maybe they ought to understand what the conservative is really saying? Or the liberal is really saying?
I think that labels used to be important to the extent that they told the people, this person here believes in the government keeping out of the way, for example, in economics, or this person believes that the government should get involved in economics. That is the good point of labels, but you're right, they are very confused now, and I think in that sense we have to try to redefine what people are in public. We have to redefine those issues. It's unfortunate.
Let's get to that redefinition in a minute, but we're going to have to take a short break. So hold those thoughts and we'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Okay, we're back. Before we left, Ed was kind of reaching toward a new definition of things here, right?
Yes, and I think maybe there is a different way we can look at this labeling, and I think it was suggested in the documentary. Possibly it might be better to look at two ends of the spectrums of being one where there's government is involved a whole lot, and then there's a government that's not involved, intervention versus non-intervention. And then you would have to get people to understand that sometimes liberals want to intervene and sometimes conservatives want to intervene, and sometimes they lie about it. I guess in the foreign policy, I don't even know whether even liberals or conservatives pretend to be non-interventionists anymore. You know, the constitutional position that we mind our own business and defend the country and stay out of the internal affairs of other nations, like most of our presidents in the first century. But if we did that, do you think that would be helpful? Do you think that is overly simplifying, or do you think telling people if they could think of it in terms of intervention versus non-intervention?
I think it clarifies matters. Right now, both parties have apples and oranges in them. They have some people who believe in freedom and some people who don't. I think it would be helpful if there was a coalition and people began to think in terms of a political structure or political philosophy that was simple non-intervention versus an intervention party or intervention philosophy.
Yeah, I think that approach is important. It also, I believe, will stimulate people's imagination who haven't even thought that there are ways of doing things without government. it's rather amazing that people consider, well, education, of course, the only way we can have education is if the government provides it. Highways, the only way we can have highways is if the government provides it. And yet, it was usually localities and the private sector with private turnpikes and toll roads that for the first century of this country provided roads. And I think if you put it in terms of non-intervention,
you know,
Ron and John, our time's getting a little short here, and we need to wind this up. So why don't we go and ask each of you for a comment on the short run for a moment. John Fund, what's the next step? What's the next thing we ought to do to try and get these confusions about labels sorted out?
People need to think for themselves. If a politician tells you he corresponds to a certain label, don't accept it. You decide what he really represents. And I would simply say that the one thing I've noticed with politicians, all of them seem to oppose the concept of term limits, which is whatever a politician is doing in office, it should be limited. And I think that since the media and all of the politicians oppose it, I think it's something the voters should look at, because it has to be a good idea if they're all opposed to it.
Ed Hudgens, what's your view? Is there a place to get started?
I think that in any public debate and discussion, we have to make, as a matter of course, certain questions come up. That is this particular expenditure, is this particular policy absolutely necessary to protect life, liberty, and property? Why is the government taking my money or restricting my freedom? Is there a real good reason for it? I think we should make these kinds of questions come up as a matter of course and have people ask their congressmen, you know, or is there a better way of doing this? Can the private sector or can private individuals do this thing for themselves? Let's change the debate. Let's change the terms of the discussion.
Ron Paul, as usual, you get the last word. What do you think?
Okay. You know, in the introduction, they talked a little bit about moderates, and moderates were looked at in a very negative manner. And they said a moderate, and to me, a moderate is somebody that endorses, you know, intervention in the economic affairs and also in personal affairs. So they sort of take government in both areas. Maybe the worst of all worlds, and these people express that. But there should be another choice, and that is when the individual, the politician, chooses to not be an interventionist and truly believe in the free enterprise system and truly being a civil libertarian, saying stay out of the personal affairs of individuals. Then that individual generally today is recognized as a libertarian, and I think people should consider that, the belief in liberty, which I happen to also believe very strongly that that is what was intended by the founders, and that we can substantiate that position very thoroughly with following the Constitution.
Well, maybe by next week I'll come up with a label I can trust for you and for the other members of next week's panel. But that's where we'll have to leave it for today. I want to thank our panelists for being with us and you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue. The National Endowment for Liberty would like to acknowledge the inspirational contribution of James M. Rodney and the sponsors of At Issue, whose generous support makes these programs possible.